In the year of the famine, the company collected more revenue than it had the year before. John Shore arrived in Calcutta in 1769 as a 17-year-old clerk. He had secured a position with the East India Company through connections, the standard route for young men who needed a career in the East, and the voyage had gone so badly, and he had been so ill on the ship, that the other passengers, watching him come down the gangway, said quietly to each other that this one would never make it to Calcutta. He made it. He settled in, learned the work, began keeping ledgers, and the following year he was traveling up the Ganges through territories where a third of the population was dying, and he looked at what was there, at the roads, at the fields, at the villages that were ceasing to be villages. He was a 17-year-old clerk in an organization that had decided the collections would continue regardless, and there was nothing he could have said that would have changed anything. 40 years later, already a peer of England, long retired as Lord Teignmouth, he wrote a poem. The first line, "Still fresh in memory's eye, the scene I view. Shriveled limbs, sunken eyes, the cries of mothers, the moans of infants." He had carried it for 40 years, through the whole career, through years in the senior posts of the same company whose policies he had watched from the banks of the Ganges at 17, and he had not been able to put it down. This is a story about how a system works when it does not consider what it is doing to be a problem. The East India Company had existed since 1600, and for most of that time it was exactly what it appeared to be, a trading enterprise. It bought and sold spices, cotton, silk, saltpeter. It maintained fortified trading posts, factories they called them, along the Indian coast. It competed with the Dutch and the French, sometimes fought them, sometimes didn't, and everything it did depended on the tolerance of the Mughal emperors whose empire spanned the subcontinent and whose permission was necessary to trade at all. The company was a pragmatic organization. Governing territory cost money and produced paperwork instead of dividends. There was no interest in governance. Then, the Battle of Plassey happened in 1757. Robert Clive, the company's military commander in Bengal, defeated the Nawab of Bengal through a prearranged betrayal of a significant portion of the Nawab's forces, who had been bribed to switch sides at the decisive moment. This was not a military triumph in the conventional sense. It was a transaction dressed as a battle, one in which the outcome had been settled weeks before the first shot was fired, and the only people who didn't know this were the soldiers who were actually shooting. The result was that the company's candidate took the throne of Bengal, and the company found itself as the power behind the power in the wealthiest province of the Mughal Empire, with the right to station troops, to set customs duties, and the right, informal at first, to determine who could do what within its trading zone. Bengal had a population of around 30 million people. It had a sophisticated agricultural economy and a textile industry that had been producing goods for export to Europe and the Middle East for centuries. Muslin from Dhaka, silk from Murshidabad, cotton cloth that was prized in markets from London to Istanbul. European travelers in the mid-18th century described Murshidabad as no smaller and no less wealthy than London. This was not a poor or underdeveloped place that the company had stumbled across. It was a prosperous place, and the company intended to extract that prosperity, and the difference between trading with a flourishing region and administering it for maximum extraction is a line the company crossed in 1757 without thinking very hard about the consequences. In 1764, after another military campaign, the Battle of Buxar, the company received from the Mughal emperor the Diwani rights over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Diwani was the Mughal term for the right to collect land revenue, the land tax, the fundamental fiscal instrument of the agrarian state, the mechanism through which any authority over a rural population ultimately expresses itself in money. The company was now authorized, by imperial grant, to collect taxes from one of the most densely populated regions in the world. It had no administrative apparatus to do this, No officials trained to govern territory, no infrastructure, no understanding of local agronomy or climate, no mechanisms for gathering information about the state of harvests across different districts, no experience of governing territory, no particular interest in the welfare of the people it was now nominally responsible for. What it had was a network of agents, a system of quotas, bonuses for meeting targets, and obligations to shareholders in London who expected returns on their investment and who, for the most part, had about as much interest in the living conditions of Bengal as in the surface temperature of the moon. The land tax in Bengal under Mughal administration had typically run at 10 to 15% of the value of agricultural produce. Under the company, it went to 50%. This is not a contested figure. It is in the company's own records. A farmer who keeps half his harvest in a good year has something to carry him through a bad one. A farmer who keeps half his harvest in a good year has nothing. The margin that historically allowed the population to survive drought, the seasonal buffer that stood between a bad year and a catastrophe, had been structurally removed before the first monsoon failed to arrive on time. Not because anyone planned a famine, but because someone planned revenue maximization, and these are the same thing from different ends. To design a system with no slack is to design a system that will break under the first serious pressure. The pressure came in 1769. A system with reserves would have survived it. This one didn't. 1768. The autumn rice harvest in Bengal is poor. Nothing unusual. It happens. The population absorbs it. 1769. The monsoon fails seriously. 50 to 60% below average in key agricultural districts. The main Kharif rice harvest, the autumn crop on which Bengal's population depended, is nearly destroyed. Grain prices double. District officers begin filing reports. The reports reach Calcutta. They are filed. November 1769. Company agent Charles Grant notes that the first signs of famine are already visible in the northern districts. He writes this down. December 1769. Grain prices in the western districts have spiked beyond what the poor can afford. Two Indian administrators, Reza Khan and Shitab Rai, proposed to the company's council a humane grain collection scheme for the coming year, adjusted to the individual circumstances of peasants rather than fixed quotas. The proposal is not answered. January 7th, 1770. Official Cartier proposes to the board that land taxes be remitted by 7% in the afflicted areas due to widespread starvation. 10 days later, he withdrew the proposal. The revenues kept being paid despite the distress, which suggested the situation was perhaps not as severe as reported. The revenues were being paid because collectors were collecting them. Farmers sold their cattle, sold their tools, ate their seed grain, the grain they needed to plant next year's crop, sold their children. When there was nothing left to sell, they died, and the collectors moved on to the next household. By June 1770, the resident at the court in Murshidabad reported that the living were feeding on the dead. What exactly he saw from the deck of a boat traveling up the Ganges that year he did not write down at the time. Perhaps he was too young to know how to write it. Perhaps he understood that writing it down had no point, not because it didn't matter, but because there was no one to give it to. He was a 17-year-old clerk in a company that had made its decisions, and his position in that structure gave him no audience, no voice, no mechanism through which his observations could have changed anything. He saw the roads. On the roads of Bengal in 1770, there were bodies, not scattered, but in such quantities that W. W. Hunter, examining the company's archives nearly a century later, described them as a constant feature of the landscape of that summer, the ordinary sight for anyone moving through the province. He saw villages that people had left, some completely emptied, the jungle already beginning to take back fields that had been cultivated for generations. He saw people eating grass and leaves in the fields they had once planted with rice. He heard that 500 people were dying each day in Murshidabad alone, that conditions in the rural hinterlands were far worse, that reports of cannibalism were considered credible. 40 years later, when he wrote the poem, critics found it weak as a piece of verse. They may be right, but it is not an artistic document. It is a document about what doesn't leave. Still fresh in memory's eye, the scene I view. The shriveled limbs, sunk eyes, and lifeless hue. He had carried it through decades of service in the same organization, through promotions and appointments, through years as Governor General of India, through an entire career built in the institution whose policies had produced what he had seen at 17 from the deck of a boat on the Ganges, and he had not been able to leave it behind. That itself says something, not about him, but about the nature of what happened. In the spring of 1770, at the height of the famine, the company announced that land taxes for the following year would be increased by 10%. William Wilson Hunter spent his career as a civil servant in Bengal and published his Annals of Rural Bengal in 1868, nearly a century after the famine. He had access to the company's own documents, the letters, the council minutes, the reports from district officers. He went through them systematically, and what he found was a record of people watching something happen and doing very little about it. Not because they were monsters, but because the institutional framework in which they operated did not recognize what was happening as a problem they were responsible for solving. His account of the summer of 1770 is where the famine becomes legible as a human experience rather than a demographic event. He wrote that all through the stifling summer, the people went on dying. The farmers sold their cattle, they sold their tools, they devoured their seed grain, they sold their sons and daughters until at length no buyer of children could be found. They ate the leaves of trees and the grass of the field. And in June 1770, the resident at the Durbar affirmed that the living were feeding on the dead. What the company was doing during this time. It purchased 120,000 mons of rice for the needs of its own army. It introduced restrictions on the movement of grain between districts, restrictions which, by its calculation, were meant to stabilize prices, and which in practice meant that rice available in areas with surplus could not reach areas of shortage. It established monopolies in grain trading through its agents, which meant that the people with the best access to information about where rice was and how to move it also had the strongest financial incentive to hold it and wait for prices to rise further. It extended some relief to the mercantile and trading classes. It provided no relief to the peasantry. Districts in which mortality exceeded 20,000 people per month were granted relief packages of 150 rupees. Neither Hunter nor most subsequent historians argued that the company had deliberately created the famine. The argument is more precise and more damning, that the company had created the conditions under which a drought became a catastrophe, and then, while the catastrophe was unfolding, continued to operate according to its normal institutional logic. The logic of revenue maximization. The system kept doing what it was designed to do. That was the problem. The debate about the Bengal famine of 1770 has run for 2.5 centuries, and it has not been resolved, because it is not really a debate about 1770. It is a debate about causation and responsibility in colonial economics, and the stakes of framing it correctly have always been political, rather than purely historical. The position of the company's defenders, then and afterward, the famine was caused by drought. The monsoon failed. The harvest collapsed. This was nature, not policy. The company administered a vast territory with an extremely limited administrative apparatus, had no precedent for dealing with a famine of this scale, and did what it could within its institutional constraints. The position of the critics, and they were there from the beginning, including William Boltz, a former company employee who published a searing account of company methods in 1772, was that the drought was the trigger, not the cause. Bengal had experienced poor harvests before without losing a third of its population. What was different in 1770 was that the peasantry had been systematically stripped of the reserves that had historically allowed them to survive bad years. A tax rate of 50% left no margin. The prohibition on grain movement between districts blocked the market mechanisms that might have distributed food more evenly. The monopolization of grain trading by company agents meant that the people with resources were accumulating food for profit while the people without resources were dying. In 1776, Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations that the drought in Bengal might have caused a severe shortage of food, but that improper regulations and injudicious restraints imposed by the company's servants on the rice trade had contributed to turning that shortage into a famine. This was Adam Smith, the foundational theorist of free markets, the man who would later be quoted in defense of non-intervention, saying in 1776 that the company's interference with the market had killed people, not nature. The regulations killed, the quotas killed, the monopoly on grain trading killed. The argument has never gone away because it is not an argument about the past. It is an argument about the relationship between the right of extraction and the obligation of protection. And it remains alive every time a state or corporation faces the question of who bears responsibility for the consequences of a system's normal operation. Amartya Sen, whose work on famine economics became the most influential analytical framework from the 1980s onward, argued that famines are almost never simply about the absence of food. They are about entitlement, who has the ability to command food under given conditions of exchange. In Bengal in 1770, there was food, or at least enough food that a different distribution mechanism could have prevented mass death. Grain existed in districts with relatively better harvests. Grain existed in the warehouses of company agents waiting for prices to rise further. Grain existed, finally, in the stocks the company itself had purchased for its army. 120,000 mons of rice acquired as an emergency measure and directed to troops and their dependents. What the peasantry lacked was the ability to pay for it, because the tax system had taken everything they had, and the ability to reach it, because the regulatory system had restricted its movement, and the political standing to make their situation visible as a problem requiring a solution, because they were subjects of a trading company whose primary obligation was to its shareholders, not to the native population. Sen also noted that India has not experienced a major famine since independence in 1947, not because the rains stopped failing, but because a democratic government with opposition parties and a free press cannot afford to ignore famine the way a trading corporation could and did. The landscape of Bengal after 1770 was not the landscape it had been before. Large portions of Birbhum district, one of the hardest hit, returned to jungle and were described by travelers as virtually impassable for decades afterward. Murshidabad, one of the great cities of the Mughal Empire, a city that European visitors in the mid-18th century had described as no smaller and no less wealthy than London, lost a significant portion of its population and never entirely recovered its pre-famine character. By the company's own estimate, losses to cultivated land amounted to a third of the total. The following year, when the rains returned and the famine abated, much of the land had no tillers. The people who should have planted the crops were dead. The cattle that should have plowed the fields had been eaten or had died with their owners. The tools had been sold to tax collectors or had rotted in abandoned yards. The economy that had begun the year as a productive agricultural system ended it as an empty landscape with a collapsing infrastructure, requiring decades to approach what it had been before, and never quite getting there. The weavers and spinners died in disproportionate numbers. Bengal's textile industry, which produced the cotton and silk goods that had made the province worth controlling in the first place, depended on a population that did not farm, that had no land to fall back on when food prices spiked. They bought their food in the market, and when the market price exceeded what their labor could earn, they had nothing. Entire weaving communities in northern Bengal ceased to exist. From 1772 onward, armed bands, Displaced, landless, many of them former soldiers from the armies the company had dissolved when it took Bengal under control, became a persistent feature of the countryside. The British called them bandits and dacoits. The historical record suggests that many of them were people who had survived the famine and had no other way to survive what came after it. The countryside they moved through was not the countryside it had been. The villages half empty, the fields reverting to scrub, the social fabric of communities that had existed for generations torn up at the root by a single catastrophic year. These bands were controlled eventually by punitive expeditions in the 1780s. Some of them became, in the memory of Bengal, something more complicated, what historians call the Sannyasi Fakir Rebellion, a 4-decade armed conflict of wandering holy men, former soldiers, and landless farmers that ranged across Bihar and Bengal from the 1760s to the 1800s, and is now remembered as one of the early forms of organized resistance against British rule. The famine also ended the system of dual governance, the fiction that the Nawab of Bengal retained administrative authority while the company collected the revenue. The famine made clear that the system was unworkable. You could not have one institution responsible for welfare and another institution responsible for taxation, with no coordination between them and no mechanism for the first to override the demands of the second. The company became the direct administrator of Bengal after 1772. This did not immediately improve conditions, but it established a clearer line of accountability, which eventually made parliamentary oversight more feasible. The shareholders received their dividends through the famine years. The company's stock price remained stable. The revenue figures for 1770 to 71 exceeded those for 1769 to 70. The famine entered the historical record in fragments, from different directions, with different interests and different framings. The company's own letters and minutes are the most complete source, and they are remarkable documents, not because they reveal cynical indifference, but because they reveal something more interesting and more disturbing: a system processing information about mass death and producing administrative responses entirely inadequate to what that information described. The letter noting that revenues had continued being paid despite distress, and using this as evidence that the situation was not as severe as reported, is the letter of a man who had no analytical tool for understanding that the payment of taxes under conditions of starvation is not evidence of moderate hardship, but of the compulsory nature of the extraction itself. A man pays the tax while he has something to sell to pay the tax. When there is nothing left to sell, he stops paying and dies. The fact of continued payment is not evidence of moderate conditions. It is a clock. How much time remains until there is nothing left to sell? The men on the council did not understand this, or they understood it and did not consider themselves obliged to think about it. The difference between those two possibilities, in terms of outcome, is not significant. William Boltz published his Considerations on India Affairs in 1772, 2 years after the famine. He had been expelled from the company for criticizing its methods. His account is clearly polemical. He had grievances, but his specific claims about company policy were largely borne out by later scholarship. He wrote about people feeding on leaves and carcasses, about children sold by their parents. His book was read in Britain. Hunter named the figure. He described the conditions. He did not quite arrive at the conclusion that the company had created the famine, but he assembled the evidence that allowed later historians to arrive there. The news of the famine reached Britain late and framed in a particular way. The first accounts appeared in the British press in 1771, in the Gentleman's Magazine and other publications read by educated audiences. They were written in a frame that would become standard for describing catastrophes in the colonies: emphasis on the scale of suffering, on the exotic details, on the almost incomprehensible death toll, and almost no analysis of how company policy had contributed to that toll. An Asian famine was a natural event, like a flood or an earthquake. It had happened over there. It was a tragedy. William Boltz's book of 1772 punched a hole in that frame. Boltz had been dismissed from the company. He had personal motives for grievance, and this made him easy to discredit. The company did exactly that, suggesting his criticism was driven by spite rather than principle. But his specific claims stood behind the company's own data, and they remained uncomfortable. He wrote about people eating leaves in carrion, about children sold for food, about the collectors who kept coming. In Parliament, the famine became part of broader debates about the nature of the company's authority and its accountability. These debates moved slowly. The company was a powerful political lobby. Many members of Parliament were shareholders themselves, and the question of what a state should demand from a private enterprise governing conquered territory had no ready answer in the political vocabulary of the time. But pressure accumulated. The Regulating Act of 1773 was the first law establishing parliamentary oversight of the company's activities in India, creating the post of Governor-General and a Supreme Court in Calcutta. The India Act of 1784 created a Board of Control, a government body with real authority over company policy. The Bengal famine was not the only reason for these reforms, but it was one of the important ones. The proof that the company could not govern itself, one too obvious to ignore. Did anything actually change on the ground? Slowly and partially. The next major famine in Bengal came in 1866. Then in 1943, under not the company, but the British government directly, under Winston Churchill, about 3 million people died, and the mechanism was the same. Wartime priorities and export quotas, and a refusal to acknowledge the scale of the problem taking precedence over the needs of the population. The institutional logic proved more durable than the reforms that tried to contain it. John Shore served the company for decades after 1770. He rose to become Governor-General of India. He helped design the Permanent Settlement of 1793, which restructured land tenure in Bengal in ways whose consequences were felt into the 20th century. He was one of the senior officials of the very institution whose policies he had watched killing people as a 17-year-old clerk on the Ganges. Through all of it, he carried what he had seen. Not publicly. He wrote no exposés, raised no political questions. He built his career, made his decisions, administered his province. And then he retired to England and wrote a mediocre poem about the summer of 1770. And the poem outlasted him. And that is now most of what people know about John Shore, that he was there and saw it, and that it would not leave him. Still fresh in memory's eye, the scene I view. 40 years, through all the offices and powers and papers and decisions, the shriveled limbs and the sunken eyes, the cries of mothers on the banks of the Ganges, the villages turning into jungle, the roads with the bodies, and in London, that year, as he traveled the river and looked, the shareholders were receiving their dividends. The quota had been met. The collections exceeded the previous years. The system had worked exactly as designed, and that was precisely the problem. Not a failure, not a malicious plan, not the exceptional cruelty of one man or one decision, but a system functioning correctly, collecting money, reporting to its board of directors, maintaining its share price, and 10 million people dying inside that correctly functioning machinery as a byproduct of its normal operation. Nobody gave the order to kill 10 million people. Nobody had to. The famine is known in Bengali as Chiator Manantar, the famine of 76, since 1770 corresponds to the year 1176 in the Bengali calendar. The name outlasted the company, outlasted British India, outlasted the partition of 1947. In Bengal, now divided between India and Bangladesh, the phrase still carries weight, not simply as a historical date, but as something closer to what historians call traumatic memory, an event so defining that it reorganizes everything before it and everything after. Poets wrote about it. Novelists wrote about it. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anandamath, published in 1882, which gave India its unofficial anthem, unfolds against the backdrop of the famine and its aftermath. The famine became the ground on which modern Bengali national consciousness grew, not as an abstract historical injustice, but as a specific, named, generational experience of destruction. John Shore did not know any of this. He was a 17-year-old clerk on a boat, and what he saw was personal rather than historical, because history is what gets named afterward, when it is possible to count the dead and draw conclusions. In 1770, there were no conclusions yet. There were only the roads and the villages and the smell and the people by the water.